It was early spring of 2018, and I had just turned 25. My friend and I had finally arrived at our favorite camping spot, Ridgeview Campgrounds, just outside of Pine Bluff, Wyoming. We typically made the trip 2 or 3 times a year. The views were incredible, and it was only a couple of hours away from the city. For the most part, the area was pretty isolated. There was a small, privately owned convenience store a few miles away, with the nearest town about 18 miles before that. The entrance to the campground was a dirt path right off the highway, marked by a simple wooden sign listing wildlife sightings, fire hazards, and other updates for campers. The road leading into the campground was mostly straight, with only one split stretching several miles. Once, we drove down the dirt road just to see where it led. One path took us to another highway entrance with a ranger station midway, while the other ended abruptly at an abandoned cabin, hidden behind dense trees and brush. Most of the snow had melted by now, leaving a crisp chill in the air. The forest was coming back to life, and we often saw wild horses, groups of deer, and plenty of little critters wandering about. It was the perfect time of year for a quiet escape from the city. We pulled in around 4:30 p.m. on a Tuesday, later than we usually arrived. We typically tried to get there by noon at the latest, but this trip had been spontaneous. We both had work over the weekend and just decided to go for it. The sun was setting fast, and we still hadn't chosen our camping spot. There were maybe 2 other groups, both families, parked near the entrance, a few hundred yards from the highway. This time, we wanted to get as far away from people as possible. Working customer service jobs will do that to you. We drove down the dirt road, passing our usual spot, before finally finding the perfect area. A small clearing at the edge of a hill, offering a stunning view of the valley below. The sunset was breathtaking. This would have become our go-to spot if not for what happened the following night. We agreed to start a campfire and decided to skip setting up a tent. We didn't have much daylight left anyway, and her SUV wasn't too uncomfortable. I planned to sleep in the back seat while she took the passenger seat, leaving the window slightly cracked for airflow. We each had a few blankets and quickly drifted off into a deep, undisturbed sleep. The next day was peaceful. We mostly relaxed, but I couldn't shake an eerie feeling that we weren't alone. Every so often, I'd hear leaves crunching just out of sight. I assumed it was just the local wildlife, but the feeling of being watched never faded. My friend didn't seem to notice anything, so I tried not to dwell on it. When night fell, the feeling lingered. My friend must have sensed something too, though she never said anything. Instead, she took some of her sleeping pills, something she rarely needed to do on our camping trips. The soothing sounds of nature were usually enough to lull her to sleep. By around 1 a.m., she had dozed off in the passenger seat while I lay in the back, scrolling through my phone. My legs were stretched out toward the car's rear door, and the opposite window was cracked open slightly, allowing a cool breeze to drift in. That's when I heard it. Footsteps crunching through the fallen leaves, several paces from the car. I whispered to my friend, asking if she had heard it, but she was already out cold. I set my phone down and listened closely for a minute or two. Silence. Maybe just a raccoon poking around the camp. I shrugged it off and went back to my phone. 10 minutes later, the sound returned, this time much closer. A distinct crunch came from right outside my door. My heart pounded as I slowly lowered my phone. My eyes took a moment to adjust to the darkness. As I turned the phone away from me, the screen's glow briefly illuminated the window near my feet. To this day, I can't forget what I saw. 2 filthy, scabbed hands gripped the edge of the window. The fingers curled inside the car, the nails long, jagged, and blackened with grime. Just beyond the glass, a face was pressed up against the window, its breath forming condensation every few seconds. I couldn't make out much, except for the reflection of its empty, soulless eyes staring straight into mine. I was frozen, couldn't scream, couldn't move. It felt like an eternity, a silent standoff between me and whatever was outside. My mind raced. Why wasn't it running if it knew I saw it? What was it planning? Was this the end for me? After what felt like 10 seconds, the hands slowly uncurled from the window and disappeared into the darkness. The condensation on the glass faded. A few moments later, I heard it, the slow, rhythmic crunching of footsteps retreating into the night. I just sat there, my mind unable to process what had just happened. Why hadn't I reacted? Why was I still sitting there? That thought jolted me into action. I pounded on my friend's seat, shaking her awake. Dazed and confused, she mumbled as I scrambled to gather anything we had left outside, throwing it all into the back seat and trunk while frantically glancing around. My hands trembled as I slammed the door shut, and that's when I saw them. 2 smudged handprints on the window. Panic took over. I wiped them away as if erasing them could make the event disappear. I jumped into the driver's seat, started the engine, and floored it out of there. My friend, now fully awake, demanded to know what was happening. "We need to go. Now, there's someone out there," I managed to choke out. I didn't see anyone chasing us, but I kept speeding down the dirt road, barely slowing down until we hit the highway. My friend insisted I pull over, and we eventually stopped at a diner about 25 miles away. There, over a cup of coffee, I explained everything. The terror faded in the months that followed, but the embarrassment lingered. People talk about having a fight-or-flight response, but I wasn't sure if I had either. I had just sat there, frozen. I still wonder who was out there. A prankster? Someone living in that abandoned cabin down the road? Or something else entirely? Something lurking in the woods, watching and waiting for lone campers to drift into unconsciousness? We continued camping in the years that followed, but never too deep into the wilderness. And whatever it was that night, I hope I never cross paths with it again. I have a cousin who lives in a remote area where everyone owns large pieces of land. He has around 600 acres where his cattle roam freely. One summer, I went to visit him and he suggested we camp out. There's a small clearing on his property with a teepee set up beneath some tall trees. A narrow trail runs through the clearing, leading down to a pond before winding back into the woods. To get there, we took his truck across a pasture and parked near the tree line. From there, we had to walk a bit through the trees to reach the campsite. Looking back, I can't recall exactly how far we walked, but it wasn't a short distance. That night, my cousin, his girlfriend, a friend she had invited, and I sat around a small campfire drinking. At one point, someone threw too much brush on the fire, and the flames shot up, igniting a few tree branches above us. For a moment, we thought we had started a massive fire, but the flames quickly died down. Later in the night, as we continued drinking, my cousin's girlfriend announced she needed to use the bathroom. I assumed she walked down the path toward the pond. The fire was burning low, so I got up to gather more wood. As I walked down the trail, I noticed a shadowy figure holding up a tree branch, as if peering back at me. Remembering that the girlfriend had gone to relieve herself, I assumed it was her and called out her name. The moment I did, the figure dropped the branch and disappeared. Just then, I heard my cousin's girlfriend calling out to me from the campsite. I turned and saw her emerging from the teepee. My heart began pounding as I looked back toward the path. There was nothing there. I stood frozen for a moment, scanning the area, but I saw no movement. Shaken, I hurried back to the camp, my pulse racing. When I arrived, everyone was there, and I told them what I had just seen. My cousin dismissed it, insisting that no one else could be on his land. We eventually shook it off and kept drinking, but the unsettling feeling lingered. Much later, I started feeling drowsy, and my cousin was preoccupied with his girlfriend, so we all settled into the teepee. I lay next to our friend, trying to fall asleep while they whispered to each other. That's when I heard it, the sound of heavy footsteps running outside the tent. It wasn't the quick, light steps of a deer or the gallop of a horse. These were distinct, heavy thuds, as if something large was moving toward us with purpose. Then, I heard a loud impact against the teepee, followed by a dragging sound, as if something had struck the fabric and slid down. My cousin, who was closest to the edge of the teepee, bolted upright and shouted. Now we were all terrified. He yelled that we needed to leave, immediately. Without hesitation, we abandoned everything, sprinted to his truck, and sped back to his house. We sat there, still in shock, trying to make sense of what had just happened. As we talked, we all agreed that whatever we heard had been moving on two legs, not four. My cousin, who had lived on that land his whole life and camped at that site countless times, admitted he had never experienced anything like it before. That was the part that scared us the most. I was 8 years old when this took place. My dad, stepmom, sister, and I traveled to a spot called Cypress Cove. It was a camping retreat where people could bring their tents or campers and stay for a few days. We had brought a camper with us. To set the scene, Cypress Cove wasn't a typical island, but it was encircled by thick trees and greenery, except for the single road leading in and out. Inside the resort, there were paths, but they were mostly for golf carts and other small vehicles. The whole area was covered in dense trees and vegetation. If you weren't on a trail, at a campsite, or in one of the activity areas, you were surrounded by forest. My family and I were spending time at one of the playgrounds. While there, I made a new friend and played with him for a while. At some point, my family left, letting me continue playing. Eventually, my friend left too, and I found myself alone as the sun started setting. This wasn't our first visit to Cypress Cove, and I thought I knew my way around well enough. I figured it would be a quick walk back to our campsite. However, at some point, I took a wrong turn and ended up in the area where boats were launched for fishing. A small group of people was there, so I approached them to ask for directions. Not wanting to give away my exact location, I lied and said my campsite was about 10 spots away from its actual number. They pointed me in a direction, and I started walking. Unbeknownst to me, my family had noticed I was missing from the playground. They had begun driving around the area in our golf cart and another one they had rented. If they hadn't, I might not be here telling this story today. As I walked toward the campsite, a car pulled up beside me. One of the people I had asked for directions earlier rolled down the window. By this time, I had been walking for over an hour, and I was exhausted. The man offered me a ride and told me to sit in the front seat. Tired and worn out, I got in. Looking back, I now realized that was a terrible mistake. At first, we were going in the right direction, but then he drove past the entrance to the campsites. That's when I knew something was wrong. I told him he had missed the turn, but he didn't respond. By some miracle, I spotted my dad in our golf cart driving in the opposite direction. I immediately started yelling and waving at him. My dad stopped his golf cart right in front of the car, forcing it to stop. I quickly unlocked the door manually and bolted to him. By then, he had already pulled out his concealed weapon and was aiming at the man. Once I was safely out of the way, my dad called the police and held the guy at gunpoint until officers arrived and arrested him. I'm sharing this now because I recently learned that this man and his family had attempted this before and had gotten away with it. I try not to think about what could have happened if my dad hadn't shown up in time. For most of my adult life, I've mostly hiked alone, always staying alert to my surroundings and paying close attention to sounds. I try to move through nature as an observer, leaving as little trace as possible. I'm also fascinated by the strange and unexplained, mysteries, cryptids, and eerie disappearances. A few years back, I planned a solo camping trip in a remote old-growth forest in western North Carolina. Most of the ancient forests there have been logged, but some untouched areas still remain. If you ever get the chance to visit such a place, I highly recommend it. There's something deeply peaceful and alive about them that's hard to put into words. This particular forest was filled with towering poplars and hemlocks, their massive trunks stretching high into the sky. I had a guidebook that led me through a maze of narrow back roads, which eventually turned to gravel as I entered a vast national forest. After a long drive, I found a small parking area near an unmaintained trail, one that clearly wasn't traveled often. I followed the path deep into the woods until it simply faded away. With barely any undergrowth, I spent the afternoon wandering among the giant trees, soaking in the stillness. Eventually, I reached a small creek, crossed it, and entered a clearing, a sunken meadow surrounded by hills and ridges. The presence of a field suggested people had once lived in the area, but I saw no sign of past settlements, and my map indicated I was miles from the nearest road or home. As the sun set, I set up my tent and made a simple meal. Later that night, I decided to relax in the open field in front of my tent, enjoying a smoke while gazing up at the stars. With almost no light pollution, the sky was a breathtaking expanse of twinkling lights. As I lay there, a distinct, heavy knocking sound echoed from the ridge where I had walked earlier that day, perhaps half a mile away. 3 loud knocks, then a long pause, then 3 more. This pattern repeated several times. The knocks were powerful, like thick wooden logs being slammed together with force, so loud that I could feel the vibrations in the air. The sound had a specific location, but the forest at night is pitch black, making it impossible to see anything beyond my immediate surroundings. I couldn't think of anything in nature that would make such a deliberate, rhythmic noise. It had to be a person, right? But why would someone be out there, deep in the wilderness, smashing wood together so late at night? I had seen absolutely no one all day, and the knocking came from the same stretch of old-growth forest I had explored earlier. Eventually, the noise stopped. I crawled into my tent with an unsettling feeling, like I had overheard something I wasn't supposed to. Or maybe the sound was meant for me. The next morning, I packed up and hiked out, hyper-aware of every sound and movement around me, expecting something else to happen. But nothing did. I've told friends about this experience. Some insist it was definitely a Sasquatch. Others think I must have been closer to someone's property than I realized. But if that were true, why would someone be out in the dark, repeatedly slamming logs together? I've hiked in many places, but I have to say Tennessee has some of the best mountains for it. Because of that, I often take trips there to hike and camp. This time, I traveled with my family in an RV and we stayed together in a small town near the Smoky Mountains. The next morning, they dropped me off roughly 12 miles away at the Bald Peak trailhead. My plan was simple: hike up, camp for the night, and return the next day. While I was no stranger to hiking or camping, I had never camped completely alone before. On top of that, I didn't bring a weapon, which is something I won't go without again. The trail was unexpectedly tough. Not incredibly steep, as I've climbed sharper inclines out west, but filled with endless ups and downs that made it feel never-ending. As the sky darkened, I realized I needed to set up camp before losing all daylight. I stopped about half a mile short of the peak, deciding to finish the climb in the morning. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. I set up my tent in a nice, flat spot, ate some food, and settled in. That's when I realized I hadn't come across a single person on my way up. At the time, I didn't think much of it, but later I wished I had. I have trouble falling asleep and often lay awake for about an hour before drifting off. During that time, I thought I heard faint footsteps circling the general area. The pattern of the steps made it seem real, but I convinced myself it was my imagination. Still, I pulled my large knife from my pack and kept it close inside my sleeping bag. The next morning, I woke up and prepared some oatmeal. While eating, I glanced at my tent and froze. Leaning against it was a small bundle of dried twigs and berries, tied together with a piece of green string. My stomach dropped. I had no idea who left it or why, but I wasn't about to stick around and find out. I packed my things as fast as possible and was gone within 5 minutes. There was no way I was going to continue to the summit now. I headed straight down. Not long into my descent, a thick fog rolled in, making it hard to see. At some point, I veered off onto a side trail without realizing it. That path eventually ended, leaving me lost. Luckily, I had a compass and managed to navigate back to the main trail. It was one of the biggest moments of relief I've ever felt. I made it back without further issues, but what I learned later chilled me to the core. That very morning, a 30-year-old man lost his life on the same stretch of trail I had been on. Had I not gotten lost and delayed my descent, there's a good chance I would have crossed paths with him. His family later removed most online articles about the incident, so details are scarce. But the most unsettling part? Knowing someone had been watching me that night, someone I never even noticed. We were only planning to camp for a single night, and the trail we chose was a section of the Appalachian Trail, close to its starting point. One of my friends shared a story he had heard from someone he knew. That person claimed to have heard voices and footsteps late at night near Shadow Mountain, forcing him to night hike because the noises became overwhelming. Anyway, back to our trip. After finding a spot to set up camp, we pitched our tent and settled in. As darkness crept in, an unsettling feeling took over, as if something unseen was keeping an eye on us. Then it happened. Roughly 100 to 150 feet beyond our campfire, we spotted a pair of glowing red eyes staring at us. At one point, my friend walked over to the small creek near our tent to splash his face with water. The next thing we knew, he claimed something shoved him forward, causing him to fall in. His shirt was completely soaked, and he hit his nose against a rock, leaving him with a bleeding cut. Not long after that, we heard a woman's voice, but the words were too muffled to understand. The sound seemed to come from multiple directions, straight ahead, behind us, and even across the creek to our left. It might have been a night hiker, but there was no trail to the left, and if anyone was moving around, they weren't using a flashlight. We kept hearing footsteps circling the campsite, accompanied by the sharp snap of twigs. In the end, we retreated to our tent and tried to sleep. My friend managed to drift off first, but as I lay awake, I heard something. Branches breaking directly beside my head, just outside the tent. That's about all that happened, but the experience was deeply unsettling. If you ever decide to camp in Blue Hollow, be aware. Something out there is watching when the night falls. I had only just moved to the US to study law. I had been attending school and made a few friends who, like me, were also from Spain. Their names were Charlotte and Lisa. We were having a great time in the US, and in September of 2022, we decided to do some exploring. We planned a road trip to Canada, intending to drive around Lake Ontario and then return to New York City through upstate New York. Being a guy, I was the designated driver, and everything went smoothly until our final night of the trip. We had rented an off-grid cabin in a secluded wooded area in upstate New York. To give an idea of the location, we were about 30 minutes from Harrisville. Lisa and I were eager to spend a night there to experience nature fully. The cabin was incredibly old, made of weathered logs, with no electricity or running water. Both Lisa and I had experience with wilderness survival in Europe. I had been a Boy Scout all my life and even led a scout group for a while. Our other two friends, though I adored them, were pure city dwellers. They had almost no experience with camping or being in an area without phone service, which was the case with this cabin. We had been driving all day, and by the time we reached the forest's edge, it was past 10 p.m. The night was pitch dark. While driving through the woods, our GPS signal failed, and I had to rely on instinct and an old-fashioned paper map. The trails were muddy, making it tricky to navigate safely. And in Charlotte, sitting in the back, became uneasy the moment they lost phone service. Then, out of nowhere, in the dense darkness, we saw a campfire. There were no houses or people around, just a perfectly maintained fire, controlled and not spreading like a bonfire. It startled us, considering how remote we were, and it was getting quite late. We soon realized we had taken the wrong trail at an earlier crossroads. After retracing our steps and a few more wrong turns, we finally reached our destination. The cabin appeared as a faint silhouette in the dark. It was so old that even the outhouse toilet was made of wood. When we arrived, it was still raining, and both Ann and Lisa were reluctant to leave the car and enter a completely unlit cabin. Lisa and I left the car headlights on and used our phone flashlights to check inside. We searched for any old lanterns, which we found, but we were unable to light the fireplace since all the wood was damp from the rain. No dry firewood had been stored. Using a small stove, I managed to start a tiny fire, giving us some warmth. Once inside, I started boiling water for pasta while the girls prepared the sleeping area and shut the windows to keep out the cold. The cabin had a small wooden ladder leading up to a raised sleeping loft where all three girls could fit, while I would take a bunk bed downstairs that looked like it had been there since before World War I. As I was cooking, and approached me quietly, mindful that Lisa and Charlotte disliked scary stories. She told me that on our way to the cabin, she had noticed an old graveyard in the woods and had seen a figure walking among the graves. At first, I laughed it off as I'm not easily frightened by ghost stories. In Spain, swearing on something sacred is serious, and swore she was telling the truth. I reassured her that I believed her but told her not to worry. I would lock all the doors before we slept. We ate our pasta, made some s'mores, and each had a beer. The girls were getting sleepy, so they went up to the loft to rest. I decided to have one more beer and sit outside, enjoying the peaceful sound of the rain. Coming from New York City, I appreciated the complete absence of artificial light. Scanning the dark forest with my flashlight, I saw nothing unusual, just trees and a small creek in the distance. The only sounds were the wind, rain, and flowing water. Then, out of nowhere, I heard a strange, deep growl. My first thought was that it might be a bear, but I had researched before our trip and knew that bears were uncommon in this part of the state. Plus, the sound didn't quite match a bear's roar. Curious but not terrified, I shone my flashlight further into the trees. That's when I saw it, a figure standing just within the tree line. It was tall, at least 6.5 feet, and covered in brown fur that blended perfectly with the autumn forest. The moment my flashlight caught its eyes, they reflected the light. It was not a bear. It stood on 2 legs, its arms were long, and it was watching me. We stared at each other for what felt like an eternity but was likely only 5 seconds. Then it moved behind a tree and let out another deep growl. That's when fear truly set in. Every hair on my body stood up. Without hesitation, I rushed inside, locked all the doors, and closed every curtain. Lying in my bunk, I tried to convince myself it was just my exhausted mind playing tricks on me. After about an hour, I finally calmed down enough to fall asleep. The rest of the night was uneventful. By morning, the sky had cleared, and the sun shone over the peaceful forest. When I stepped outside, everything seemed normal. No strange footprints, no disturbances, just a beautiful, quiet landscape. We had breakfast and packed up for our drive back to the city. I never mentioned what I saw that night to the others, knowing they wouldn't want to hear it. But after months of thinking about it, I figured this was the best place to share the experience. If anyone has any rational explanation for what I saw, I'd be interested to hear it. This all started when I was around 11. My sister, dad, stepmom, and her 2 daughters went camping. We'd only been there for a day, and everything was fine. My sister and I decided to walk to the stream by ourselves. Dad gave us a walkie-talkie to keep in touch while we were gone. The place we were going was surrounded by thick bushes, and you had to walk down a small path to get there. We spent some time barefoot, splashing around in the water, when Jade said she saw someone standing among the trees. We all looked, and there was a figure. It was dark, but we could tell it had the shape of a man, though we couldn't see his face. We stared at it for a few moments before it vanished. We shrugged it off and kept playing, but I felt uneasy. A bit later, we glanced back to see if it was still there, and it was. Everything was silent. I could barely hear the water running in the stream. After about 20 minutes, we decided to head back to camp. My sister hung back a little, and I was about 20 meters ahead of them, but we couldn't see each other. I heard a twig snap behind me and turned, thinking my sisters had caught up. But no, I looked and saw a tall, dark figure standing just a foot away. I immediately started running. The whole time, I felt it was right behind me. I ran as fast as I could until I was out of the open campground, and then it was gone. My sisters caught up soon after, and I told them what happened. I asked them, but none of them had seen him behind me. They had been too far behind, and the path was winding, so they were usually around a corner. During the rest of the camping trip, we didn't see him much, but sometimes we'd catch a glimpse of him standing there. Fast forward a few years, and we went camping again with my dad's new girlfriend and her daughter, Stella. I can't remember much of that trip, but I know for sure Stella saw him too. 3 years ago, I started seeing him at my house, just about everywhere. One day, I was outside in the backyard, getting ready to pet my cat, when out of the corner of my eye, I saw him right behind me. I looked at my cat to try to block it out, and as I did, I felt a hand grab my hair and pull. I spun around immediately. Now, I live with my boyfriend, and I can't say for certain if I've seen him again. But sometimes, I see shadows moving behind me in the reflection of the TV, and when I look, there's nothing there. I try to convince myself it's just a trick of the light. However, something happened recently. My boyfriend's alarm went off for work, waking me up too. He turned it off but stayed in bed a little longer. I was awake, lying on my side, facing his back with one eye closed, my face pressed against the pillow. Suddenly, I swear I heard someone whisper my name right in my ear. It was so clear, and I even felt a cold breath on my skin. I sat up and asked my boyfriend, "Did you say my name?" He looked confused. He was just sitting there, playing on his phone. He said he hadn't said anything. I'm sure it was a woman's voice. I'm not certain if it connects to my previous experience, but I wanted to add this part, as I'm dying to know what's happening. One summer, I went on a camping trip with my parents, younger brother, and a close friend. My friend and I were about 14 or 15 years old at the time. We stayed at a campground where my parents and brother slept inside our small camper, while my friend and I set up a tent just a few feet away, all within the same campsite. It was late at night, probably close to midnight. My friend and I were inside the tent with our flashlights on. The entire campground was eerily quiet, as if everyone had gone to bed. Out of nowhere, we heard a boy shouting for help. The yelling got louder and closer, and soon we could hear him sprinting toward us. Panicked, we fumbled to turn off our flashlights. Just then, the shadow of someone's feet raced past our tent. Holding our breath, we sat frozen as another set of footsteps pounded the ground right behind him. We stayed like that for a long time, too afraid to move. When I finally dared to peek outside, there was nothing, no movement, no sound. It was as if nothing had ever happened. What baffled us most was that no one else seemed to have noticed. We ran to the camper, expecting my family to be alarmed, but they insisted they hadn't heard a thing. That made no sense to us. The cries for help had been so loud, so close. Even now, years later, my friend and I still talk about it. It happened around 2008, and we can't shake the eerie feeling of that night. We know what we heard, but it's like we were the only ones who did. The whole thing still creeps me out. My family lives near the base of a hill and owns 2 acres of land, 5 of which are cleared, while the rest remains wooded. I have the back section of an old, retired emergency vehicle that we set up not far from our mobile home so that I could hook up electricity and internet to it. This happened when I first started sleeping out there. A friend and I had decided to stay the night in it. We were both 17 at the time and having a sleepover. I don't remember the exact hour, but it was still completely dark outside when I heard a deep voice, far too deep for either of us, saying, "Hey, hey," more than once. The first time it sounded like it came from outside, but the second time, it seemed as though it was inside with us. I turned over and saw my friend sound asleep, their eyes shut completely. At first, I thought I was just dreaming since I wasn't fully awake. But the next day, when I mentioned it, my friend admitted they had heard the same thing, just at a different point in the night. They said that when they looked over at me, I had been knocked out cold, eyes shut tight. Could it have been some random person muttering nonsense through the window screens, which we had left slightly open to let in the cool night air? Or was it perhaps the lingering spirit of someone who passed away in that vehicle, unable to move on? I have no idea, but the eerie feeling it left behind stuck with me for a long time. This is a story from a close friend who was camping with their family. A mother, father, and their 2 young daughters were on a hiking trip in Oregon. They trekked deep into the mountains for nearly 10 miles before setting up camp. Everything was peaceful until about an hour after nightfall when they heard footsteps approaching on the trail. No flashlight, just the sound of someone walking. The footsteps stopped just outside their tent. My friend's husband unzipped the tent to see who was there. Standing outside was a nearly unclothed man with tangled hair and an enormous beard, staring at him. When they tried asking him questions, the only thing he muttered was, "Fasten the figures." Panic set in. Why was a barely dressed man telling them to fasten figures? What figures? And how does one even do that? It was too dangerous to hike back to the car in the dark. So they zipped the tent shut and stayed on high alert all night while the man lingered near their fire pit. At dawn, they packed up and started hiking back. The man trailed them for most of the way, always staying just behind them. He didn't seem to be on drugs, and he had nowhere to carry anything since he was only wearing an elaborate loincloth. About halfway back to their vehicle, he suddenly disappeared off the trail. They tried to put the whole thing behind them until they reached their car. Written in chalky soap on every window were the same eerie words, "Fasten the figures."